According to multiple reports, Indiana Fever guard Caitlin Clark will not be heading to the Paris Olympics next month. The rookie will not be on the USA women's basketball national team roster, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not Clark should be on the roster. Clark's start to her WNBA career has also sparked a great deal of discourse from fans and media around the W. So let's discuss Clark not making the Olympic roster and much more with the W. We're going to do that with a writer and analyst covering women's hoops for CBS Sports, my good friend Erica Ayala, who joins me now. Erica, how's it going?
It's going well, Dexter. Always happy to chat hoops with you.
Same here, same here. You were one of the first people I thought about in terms of having this conversation and having it with nuance, which I think we could do, and I think we will be able to do here. And Erica, Caitlin Clark not being selected for the 12-woman roster for the 2024 Summer Olympic Games has caused quite a stir, as I know you've seen among fans and media, with some believing that her exclusion from the roster is a significant snub. What are your initial thoughts on this decision by USA Basketball?
You know, I think it's interesting if what we're seeing is reported. I mean, my first reactions to the roster is that it's a pretty solid roster. We know that USA Basketball, the women's senior team, is looking for an 8th consecutive gold medal, unprecedented. I mean, we have some elite level national teams, particularly on the women's side, including the U.S. women's deaf soccer team. And those two, it's U.S. deaf women's soccer and USA Basketball that have the most consecutive international medals. And so to think that the roster is pretty solid, that's some elite level players. Now, with Caitlin Clark not being on the roster, I'm not surprised. I think that there are a few things that went into this, including that Caitlin Clark, and the last camp, to no fault of her own, hasn't been at USA Basketball camps as much as some of the other players have been on the roster. You also look at Ryan Howard, who was named to the 3x3 team, also has been a part of that 5-on-5 mix, but will be at the Olympics on the 3x3 roster. So I wouldn't call Caitlin Clark's omission from the roster, if indeed this is the final roster, as a snub. I do think this could be fuel to Clark's fire as she moves forward. But I think there's still a few more developmental steps. And I think if indeed Clark is off the roster, I think it's a good choice overall. And the roster looks pretty solid. I think they'll be able to compete and to go for that 8th gold medal in Paris.
Yeah, I think they absolutely will. It is a strong roster, some of the best women in the world on this USA Basketball squad that has been reportedly announced. Now, there's been a lot of discourse around Caitlin Clark being targeted with physical play, and even some saying that she's being hated on by other players in the W. How much of this do you think is related to her high-profile status as a rookie in the WNBA, or are there other factors here at play, Erica?
Wow, that's kind of the question. I think if you ask especially the Black women in the WNBA, they'd say there's a lot at play here. You have everything kind of gravitating towards this magnetic pull that is Caitlin Clark. And I mean that more as a personality or a persona. And we can talk about what the actual Caitlin Clark has been saying about some of these things. But you have a player that captivated not just a basketball community, but a sports community in her senior year before going #1 overall to the Indiana Fever. And even though Diana Taurasi, Breanna Stewart, and the incomparable Cheryl Swoops tried to tell us that this was going to be a tough transition, the larger narratives in, I would argue, sporting outlets that have a very large following but have done very little women's basketball and WNBA coverage, the storylines are getting a little bit intertwined and mixed and mingled. What are the facts? The WNBA is an elite league. Only 144 spots, and at any given time, not all 144 are even occupied, to slim the rosters down even more and to finagle, shall we say, cap space. We also know that the WNBA for a very long time was not getting the coverage that it deserved. Diana Taurasi, Breanna Stewart, we've heard Kelsey Plum in particular talk about those things. So do I feel things are different with Caitlin Clark? Yes and no. Again, that gravitational pull that magnetic pull towards the Caitlin Clark show, that's the difference. But the nuances and the issues about coverage, they remain. And I think the balance that we're seeing, or the imbalance that we're seeing, is that people without that context, without the nuance, and who quite honestly don't regularly have either Black women or actual WNBA players on their programs, are running with narratives that are, let's say, half baked.
Yeah, I think half-baked is a pretty good way to put it. And I think it's been frustrating for me to watch, and you and I have talked about this as well, too, that the narratives that have been around this that are not necessarily rooted in fact, and that's been frustrating, I think, for a lot of people who love the league and also cover the league like yourself. Now, I want to ask you about this because race, gender, and sexuality often intersect in sports discourse, and probably even more so when it comes to the WNBA. How do you think these factors are playing into the way Caitlin Clark is perceived and treated both on and off the court?
And those are some of the other factors exactly that I was alluding to. As of right now, we know that Caitlin Clark identifies or is identified as young, white, and straight. And she is a rookie playing in the WNBA that is overwhelmingly Black and embraces not only its queer players, but its queer fan base. And that has been a struggle over time. When the WNBA was more, there was a little more oversight in the NBA, especially in the early years. Even players like, I keep mentioning it, but Diana Taurasi was put in promos in a halter top. We would never, and her hair down. That is not the Diana Taurasi we see 20 years later into the league, still crushing it for the Phoenix Mercury, by the way. Sue Bird, who recently retired and is now a part of the ownership group in the Seattle Storm, has talked about it. You even have other players. Again, I'll mention Kelsey Plum has talked about it. There are all these narratives that follow women, women in sports, women who love sports, and especially women who play sports, that have nothing to do with how WNBA players classify themselves. But Caitlin Clark, for a lot of people, represents what people think WNBA players, or acceptable, marketable basketball players and women athletes, should be. And this is where the, again, half-baked narratives, or quite honestly the microaggressions, the different ways that subtle racism factors in. This is how Caitlin Clark ends up at the center of a league that's almost 80% Black women, and again, does represent queer identity. It's a way to deflect, perhaps, from narratives that some outlets, some people are not comfortable with. And that's not the WNBA. And what we also know about the WNBA is, whether it's its players or its fans, they are not going to tolerate being misrepresented. Those days are gone. No more DT in a tank top. She's going to show up as her authentic self. And the expectation is that everyone who enters the WNBA will be able to do that. And so sometimes you have to check people, just like, Caitlin Clark getting checked, or having her shot blocked. It's all love, for love of the game and for the product. That's, I think, what's being missed. Yes, WNBA fans, diehard WNBA fans, will fact check you, and will go hard in the paint if the facts are not there. But that is because for too long, their storylines have been manipulated and altered to be what they are not. And I think for a lot of people, they see this in the broader culture part of the WNBA as a regression back to those days, instead of embracing the new players like Caitlin Clark, Cameron Brink. Kate Martin is a fantastic story. There is room for all of that. But unfortunately, again, it's a little bit of headline wars right now to see who's going to gather the most attention.
Yeah, no, I love what you said there, too, because there is room for all of that. The W as a league has been about that, and room for everybody and letting everybody be their authentic self, as you said. But it appears to be some conversation of wanting to let people be their authentic self, or trying to put it in a box of what people should be within the league. I'd ask you this. From your experience as a journalist covering the W, how do you think the media coverage of Caitlin Clark compares to that of other rookie stars in the WNBA? Because you just mentioned a few. Are there notable differences in the tone or focus of the coverage around these players?
I think Yes and no. I think let's start with Caitlin Clark representing what is, generally speaking, palatable, right? What is acceptable behavior as a woman who happens to also be an elite level athlete. And I mentioned some of the qualifiers or identifiers that are pointed out with Caitlin Clark that are, again, acceptable and palatable, that maybe are different than the larger WNBA. She's white. She is young, and she is a fantastic player. But we have seen this before, whether it was Brianna Stewart, Sue Bird, I mentioned already. I've mentioned Kelsey Plum, and someone that New York fans know well, Sabrina Ionescu. What do all of them have in common? Diana Taurasi as well. All #1 picks, all had historic NCAA seasons, and all got a lot of attention in their first handful of years. Now, that did come with criticism. Liberty fans know how Sabrina Ionescu was and is still criticized in how she handles everything from on the court and off the court. But the difference, if I'm talking from Diana Taurasi all the way up to Sabrina Ionescu, with Caitlin Clark, there are more eyes. That's undeniable. I don't think any basketball fan, any sports fan is going to deny that Caitlin Clark is bringing a whole new crop of attention to women's basketball that now is in the WNBA. The difference is that with those other athletes, for the most part, the outside noise from people who don't often tap into the WNBA, those storylines, those headlines, they dissipated much earlier than they are for Caitlin Clark. And I think it's just really interesting to see that the physicality is the thing that is bothering people so much, as if basketball isn't a physical sport. We can look at the NBA, we can look at international play. I mean, we had Kobe Bryant in the Olympics go after his
Yeah.
NBA teammate, because that's what you do in sports. You have to show that you aren't going to back down. And that's what veterans are going to do. Reggie Miller was just talking about that, and he's qualified to talk about women's basketball because he's not even the best Miller basketball player in his
Right.
family. That would be his sister, who, had she not gotten an injury, an unfortunate injury at a time where ACL injuries, we just didn't really know a lot about the recovery process, she probably would be tops in all WNBA categories, the one and only Cheryl Miller. And so when Reggie Miller is saying, listen, I had my welcome to the NBA moment. I had to play against Michael Jordan. He's sitting next to, Mark Jackson, talking about what it was like as a rookie to come into the NBA. And yes, know that people are going to hand you the business, because they know, especially for a rookie that's getting a lot of attention, they have to make sure that rookie toughens up quickly, whether that's their rookie on their team or for the league. So if you want to see this as hate, if you want to see this as targeting, it's all about making sure that every link in the WNBA is as strong as it can possibly be. And sometimes we are forged and fortified by the tough things that we go through. And that is a part of making sure that the league is successful. That's a part sometimes of making sure your team is successful. And yeah, when you recognize that someone has potential, not to quote Love and Basketball here,
That's
but
one of
it's
my
when you're
favorite movies. You
quiet.
can do that.
Hey, come on, right? Hey, if I'm not in your ear, if I'm not talking to you, that's when you worry. But if I'm giving you pointers, if I'm trying to toughen you up, if I'm trying to make you better, that's because I see the potential. So I think Caitlin Clark should take it as a compliment. And we've seen that's exactly what Cameron Brink has done.
Yep.
That's exactly what Angel Reese has said that she's done. So the narratives, they're following Caitlin Clark. She's getting swept into this media storm. I think she's doing the best that she can. But I think once we see the dust settle, hopefully it will settle soon. I think, we've got All-Star coming up. If indeed Caitlin Clark isn't on the USA basketball team, as it's been reported, will she be a WNBA All-Star? That's going to be a whole nother set of headlines and conversation. But my hope truly for Caitlin Clark, who is an amazing player in the NCAA, is that she does find her way. There is a little bit of toughening up that she has to do. There's also, and we know this from her college career, she's also got to get a little more discipline. She's already got 3 technical fouls. We know that she's not afraid. She doesn't back down. She will run her mouth. She'll even get on herself, bang a basketball into her forehead. That's just who she is. She's intense. And she's always going to be that way. And that's what makes her a great basketball player. Now it's about refining it, learning the WNBA, and hopefully learning an international game as well so that we do see her on another roster. And wouldn't it be great if USA Basketball has Caitlin Clark for the next Olympics, the next Summer Olympics, which are going to be hosted right here in the United States?
That would be fantastic, and everybody will be looking forward to that for sure. Last thing for me, real quick, Erica, what impact do you think all of the discourse that we've seen around Caitlin Clark will have on both her career and her relationship with USA Basketball and the broader WNBA community? Because you've said you hope that the conversation sort of shifts, right, or things will tone down a bit. But what impact do you think this will have going forward?
Well, I'll start with what I hope, because I do think that there is a way through here. We're seeing, hand over fist that the numbers for viewership, for readership, for engagement are sky high for a lot of individual teams and the WNBA. So there's a lot of potential here. But what I'm a little bit concerned about is that we'll see these peaks in numbers, and because again there's a little bit of these headline wars or some half-baked ideas, the people who are coming for the salacious headlines won't stay, and that's a little bit tragic. But I think another thing that can also be something that we have to be mindful of is if women's basketball fans stop engaging with women's basketball coverage because they're also fatigued and exhausted by how the narrative is being spun. So I'm curious to see how the numbers are towards the end of this season. But what I think is going to happen is that, similarly to Sabrina Ionescu, I think is the most recent example that we can use, Caitlin Clark is going to have to figure out a way. She's going to have to figure out her persona a little bit separate from her as a person. She now is a brand. That's undeniable. We've known that for a few years now. And sometimes you have to refine the brand just a little bit, decide what you're going to engage with, what you're not going to engage with. And there are some things that, Sabrina has come under criticism of this as well. What is Sabrina? What will Caitlin do to maybe curb some of the sensational headlines and show that she's a part of the WNBA? She's a part of the Indiana Fever. And as a white woman, as a white straight woman, she understands the impact that what she says and doesn't say has on how the league is perceived. Is it fair? Absolutely not. That being said, if you know your history, if you know your WNBA history, that's what I'm expecting will happen. We'll also have to see Caitlin Clark shift a little bit and how she presents her brand and the things that she's willing and able to confidently speak up about that are outside of the X's and O's of the game.
Yeah, and it's going to be an interesting conversation going forward around her. Look, it's been a lot we've talked about with her, but it's been a fantastic start to the season for the W. But I think, as you said, there needs to be balance, Erica, and that's why I appreciate you coming on and talking with me, because the needs for these conversations with nuance are actually so important. That is the great Erica Ayala. Please go check out her work with CBS Sports. Does a fantastic job writing and also being an analyst as well. Erica, always good to talk some nuance hoops with you. We'll do it again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.